do so.
Okay.
Uh, Hello, everyone. And let me say at the beginning that it is a tremendous honor to give a speech in honor of my mentor, James R. Crotty. And it's a double honor to give a speech for the Japanese Society for Political Economy. 20 years ago, I had a chance to address the JSPE, and I see that Professor Yokokawa, who helped me in that speech, is in the audience, and I extend my regards to him. And I would say also to Professor Akira Matsumoto and to Yoshi Sato and other friends who are there. And I hope to see everyone very soon. This speech will be a journey through the work and the thinking of James R. Crotty. It will be a little bit unusual in some ways. The first one is that here's the first of all, let me give you there's the story we're going to tell. We're going to move more or less in chronological order, and I'm going to show the key developments in Crotty's work, which are captured in A, B, and C. First, his understanding of the political business cycle and his training in macroeconomics, then his encounter with Marx, C, his encounter with Keynes and the Keynesians, and that leads to a flowering of work, which we will capture in the last part of the lecture today. And so this is something that I'm very happy to give to you. And here's a picture. If you have not met Jim Crotty, he's a very tall man, and you will notice that he always wears a blue shirt. Actually, I'm wearing this blue shirt in his honor. It's when we traveled together in Japan and Korea, actually, he only wore blue shirts. And he told me it was very simple. He just took a large supply, so he didn't have a choice problem. So you see that he's 80 years old now, and he will turn 81 in December. And you can see that he was a teacher for many years at UMass Amherst. And in addition, before that, SUNY Buffalo, the State University of New York at Buffalo, and got his PhD in economics at Carnegie Mellon in 1973. Now, we'll go through all of that. What's going to be a little bit unusual in this talk is that I'm going to take advantage of a very wonderful interview done by two of his former students, J.W. Mason and Arjun Jayadev at UMass Amherst in 2016. There's a photo capture from this interview. It's actually available on YouTube, and I would urge you to have a look. I'm going to take clips from this, and I have to warn you, this lecture will be long by invitation of your president and chairman, and there will be many words, and that's because Jim Crotty is a man of words. And so I'll try to make sure that it's easy. And what we're going to do here is when we have words that are written by Jim in papers that he's published, you will see this background of yellow. When we have words from the interview with Mason and Jayadev, we'll have this gray background. So I'll be going back and forth between my words and Jim's, and in the interviews and in his articles. Okay, let's start with background. And I will speak these words so that you can give some sense of Jim. I was born at a very young age. It was fun growing up in the Bronx when I grew up. I grew up in a working class area, somewhat ethnically segregated, except for the Italian neighborhoods. Tons of kids together. You can do whatever you want. You get in trouble if you wanted. You can go play ball all the time. Until I left New York, there were mostly only people like me, like our family. My father was a bus driver for the city, a trade union guy, and he was active. He didn't have a leadership role. I didn't have politics, as you know, but I did have a kind of unconscious class consciousness. Well, my parents were Irish immigrants, and at that time, the Irish immigrant community just did whatever the church said. or at least it insisted that everybody else do whatever the church said, and God wouldn't maybe see you when you were doing what you weren't supposed to be doing. The church ruled with a tough hand. I have to say that I had exactly that kind of upbringing, including tough Catholic schools. Now, we then go to the first occasion in which Asia and East Asia, Southeast Asia, plays a critical role in Jim's development. And let's start here. He goes to Carnegie Mellon and then begins to teach in 1966 at the State University of New York at Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo. So SUNY Buffalo and the town of Buffalo was a hotbed of anti-war movement, massive resistance, massive student movement, militant student movements, gigantic marches, cataclysmic clashes with the police, who were extraordinarily vicious and repressive. A lot of the job of the police when I was in Buffalo was essentially as an occupying force in the black area. Plus, the student body was confronting a draft. The draft forced students to take seriously this question of should they go kill people in Southeast Asia and maybe get killed or maimed in Southeast Asia, and if so, why? So I got sucked up into this. And then as soon as you get sucked up into this, you have to get serious about the issues of poverty and inequality and racism and imperialism and so on. I found out that economics, which I thought was fun, formally fun, like a game, what I did realize early was that it had nothing to do with the lives of anyone I knew. Now, first part of his work on the political business cycle, class conflict, and macro policy. So he had doctoral research at Carnegie Mellon for those 5 years before he started to teach. Now, you'll see that he didn't get his doctorate until 1973. But this time at Carnegie Mellon put Crotty at the hub of what would become the intellectual birthplace of the rational expectations hypothesis revolution in macroeconomics. That revolution would, by the end of the 1970s, completely undercut the neoclassical synthesis Keynesian macro models. It was the new revolution. It leads to the kind of new classical economics, macroeconomics that we have today. Now, the faculty there included Alan Meltzer, older generation monetarist, also Leonard Rapping, and younger generation hotshots, Robert E. Lucas, Edward Prescott. Now, those are two people who won Nobel Prizes for leading this revolution against the Keynesians. Rapping and Lucas published the first REH paper ever in 1969. To give you a flavor of that revolution, here's a quote from it. Cyclical increases in unemployment occur when workers quit their jobs because of wages or salaries fall below expectations. You see, unemployment is a choice. We're not making enough money, so we quit our jobs. That's why we have unemployment. This is a kind of thinking that goes into the heart of neoclassical theory with these, as I call them, young guns. Now, these young guns would have been developing a hypercritical internal critique of conventional mainstream macro. They would have been looking at every mathematical nuance. Now, this helped Jim because, one consequence of his training at Carnegie Mellon was that he had a very deep mathematical understanding of the formal structure of mainstream models, right? Encouraged by these critics from the right, of the precise nature and limitations of their dependence on general equilibrium theory and the efficient market hypothesis. And he was impatient with those who professed to object to the mainstream, but were not willing to throw off these assumptions in their own theorizing. He saw to the heart of the mathematics and was impatient with those who were willing to compromise. This detailed understanding is evident in some of his early publications. I won't bother with this one to the right, but if you study it, you'll see that it has to do with finding a very particular assumption in an article by Anne Friedlander and turning it into a publication in the QJE, one of the top 5 journals. Okay, at the same time though, Jim is developing his radical political economy, and this is the first step. I'll find here 2 papers. This paper, first one, is the one for which he became known globally with Rayford Body Class Conflict and Macro Policy, the Political Business Cycle, published in the RRPE 1975. I'll just read this one part. With the principal exception of the brilliant 30-year-old essay by Skidelski, the political aspects of full employment, radical political economists have done little to explain and interpret short-run macro policy and the phenomenon of the business cycle in terms of their class implications. This failure has political ramifications. The recurrent pattern of economic expansions and contractions affects not only the welfare of the working class, but its militancy and class consciousness as well. You know, we could read that sentence today and understand how important that insight is. In this paper, we develop a class conflict theory of macroeconomic policy based upon Marx's view of the state and his theory of the dynamics of competitive capitalism. Specifically, we assume that the maximization of corporate profits is the objective of government fiscal and monetary policy, and show that the pursuit of this objective requires the business cycle. Throughout the post-World War II period, the profit share and absolute level of profits have fallen in the latter half of every expansion. Correspondingly, wages and wage share have risen. We view the erosion of profits as the result of successful class struggle waged by labor against capital, struggle that is confined and ultimately reversed by the relaxation of demand and the rise in unemployment engineered by the capitalist and acquiesced in and abetted by the state. Now, there was a reply to this article written by Howard Sherman, who was my colleague at UC Riverside. And so we'll pick up what Sherman said, and I'll read this and then make a comment about what we see with Crotty here. In fact, I will make a comment between the two paragraphs. Okay, first, in the opening paragraph of his article, Howard Sherman notes that the U.S. economy is suffering from a strange disease, combining a high rate of inflation with massive unemployment, and suggests that this disease is caused by a rising degree of monopoly power. He counterposes this position to the view attributed to us, that the crisis is set off by a profit squeeze caused by higher labor costs, strong unions, as the labor markets tighten. Sherman contends that labor costs are not the primary cause of increasing costs in the latter part of expansions, and that the slow growth of wages actually leads to a realization problem. Now, I'm going to pause here. And I think somebody may have their microphone on. I would say just turn off your mic right now if you're listening. Okay, what we have here is Sherman is participating in the idea of the stagnation, global stagnation, underconsumption problem that's emphasized in the work of, say, Barron and Sweezy in Monopoly Capital, and then by Magdoff and Sweezy in Monthly Review. And okay, we admit that, and actually Crotty will talk a lot about that problem in his work, but here he's also emphasizing that labor and labor struggle, the exploitation of labor, is also at the center of the problem of capitalist reproduction and capital accumulation. And Sherman basically is throwing out a theory that in a sense ignores or invisibilizes the class struggle and talks instead about the problem of monopoly. Well, Crotty for Crotty, you cannot have just half of a theory. Okay, back to his words. In this reply, we reaffirm the proposition that in the absence of controls, the squeeze on profits in the latter half of the expansion is related to rising labor costs, not higher materials prices or other costs. However, we want to stress that we do not believe that the labor cost squeeze on profits constitutes a complete explanation of or theory of crisis. A Marxian theory of crisis must be grounded in a theory of accumulation encompassing the forces and relations of production, the competition and imperialist rivalry, as well as the impact of class struggle as partially manifested through wage struggles. Now, move to the second part of his intellectual journey. And we just briefly visit the interview from INET. And there was a question asked by the interviewer. Well, now we're going to move on to your intellectual engagements over the last 20, 25 years. The big question is your synthesis of Marx and Keynes. I think for a lot of us who are trying to describe your project, that's an accurate description of your work. It's a macroeconomics that brings these two approaches together. I know that you used to sort of jokingly call Keynes a minor post-Marxian. Crotty, it's only half a joke. I mean, Marx is clearly the more brilliant social scientist and thinker and philosopher with a much more ambitious project, one that has clearer and deeper political roots. Okay, now, just to remind us that at this point, we have, if we look at Crotty's, or look at the scenario of Marxian theory in the 60s and 80s, you have a variety of approaches. You have, I'm not going to spend time on them here. David Harvey with his very functionalist view of finance and crisis, finance as a spatial fix in the cities. You have social structures of accumulation theory that focuses on labor extraction, the cost of job loss, that's Bowles and Gordon and so on, how institutional structures enable the exploitation of labor, and the French regulation school that tries to identify regimes of accumulation. I won't bring in here the Uno school approach, which actually in some sense picks up the best of some of these things, but just to say that the alternative that Crotty finds is, in a sentence, an institutionalist, historicized approach to Marxian economic theory that is combined with a rereading that's it's derived from a close rereading of all three volumes of Capital and the theories of surplus value in particular. This reexamination leads to an understanding of the importance of the monetary dimension of all economic activity in capitalism, and an understanding that crisis means a breakdown in the lattice work of credit relations. That's a quote from Marx, that builds up in the bust before the boom, and again, to quote Marx, the slaughter of capital that resets the system. So back to the issue. I won't quote from the very famous article in 1985 that Crotty wrote, but here's a description that has the charm of his voice speaking to these former students. As you may have noticed in my work, I can find a place in Marx where he said everything, right? So I'm prone to attribute everything possible to Marx. I have a paper called Marx on Money, which indicates that Marx did have an insight about this, about the uncertainty and instability and cyclical parts of this. He also has stuff, especially in volume 3, where he talks about financial fragility, basically where there has to be certain prices and certain payments, and they have to be done at a certain time. Otherwise, you can't get a financial crisis. So why do we need Keynes? I think the reason Keynes is helpful is that up until I wrote that paper in 1985, we had several generations of Marxists who never saw this. Of course, he's talking about US-based and UK-based Marxists. They had no theory of money and finance and uncertainty and instability. At least I couldn't find any. Keynes puts this stuff center stage, right at the entry point. In my 1985 paper, I say that the financial markets and processes are theorized at the highest level of abstraction in Marx. It indicates it's very important in his own theory. Keynes really puts this stuff center stage. It's not as good as Marx at all, because Marx has a much better theory of the real sector than Keynes. Marx has got a better integrated system, a better historical sense, a better evolutionary sense than Keynes. But Keynes has some properties that are, I think, very positive additions to Marx. And I have to say, I have memories of Tetsuji when we were both at UMass. Often we would be speaking in the UMass cafeteria, and Tetsuji would say, "Oh, there's a great book about this, only in Japanese." Unfortunately, I could not read then, and I cannot read today, to my shame. Okay, so just a page of Jim's important renewal of the link between Marx and money. He contrasts the intention of Marx, that is his didactic intention in Capital, the logic of the order of presentation of ideas, with his description of why crises occur. So yes, he says, yeah, okay, we start with simple commodity production in the first part of Capital, but then we get to money as means of circulation and money as means of payment when we read the entire edifice of Marx. So he shows that And Marx shows, and Keynes and Crotty shows regarding Marx, that simple commodity production doesn't exist within capital formations as such. These formations come along with monetary circulation and payment systems that constitute abstract forms of crisis. It's the separation of purchase and sale in time and space leave open the possibility of disappointment, of the collapse of that lattice work of credit, debt deflation cycles, and so on. So it's the monetary and credit structures which depend on securing margins and which surround labor extraction processes that explain why, say, falling rates of profit, for whatever reason they fall, lead to crisis and not to a sort of gentle decline. For Crotty, then, how capitalism works is what we must theorize. And then consider that his ideas were maturing in a decade, the 1980s, marked by financial crises, alongside financial deregulation, and even market panic, such as the 1987 stock market crash. Financial chaos was there, not just class conflict. This leads him back to Keynes. Now we go into the next part of the talk with the INET interview. Why Keynes? So the interviewer, what is it that you get from Keynes that you don't get from Marx? Why is actually Keynes, in terms of his place in your own work, more than a minor post-Marxian? What's the value of trying to join these two together, as opposed to simply being a Marxist or simply being a Keynesian? Crotty, well, I could never be simply be a Keynesian. I could live as simply as a Marxist. So I think the question that needs to be answered is why, for me, is not why Marx, because I think he's the most insightful theorist and critic of capitalism ever, but rather why Keynes? I guess that at the root, Keynes to me is two things. He created a model which stood in conflict against the classical model of his time, which basically said that in a lightly regulated economy, that a lightly regulated economy works very well, and that this is the classical model, and only has a single equilibrium it can achieve, full capacity equilibrium. If something moves or shocks the economy off full employment, there are automatic processes that will restore it to full employment right away. Keynes's theory, by contrast, showed that there are multiple possible equilibrium positions, including deep depression, because aggregate demand determines output and employment, and aggregate demand or total expenditures can settle down anywhere. Now, Marx wouldn't be surprised about this. In some ways, there's very little, we're continuing the interview here, there's very little in Keynes that you can't find in Marx, but the aggregate demand model was a tremendous intervention of formalizing that model. The second contribution is the courage of Keynes to say that there are crucial economic decisions which one has to make now, the results of which will not be revealed until many years in the future. And Keynes said, I'm going to construct a theory of capitalism, the dynamics of capitalism, with an entry assumption that the future is totally unknowable and it's created by decisions made in ignorance now and its path dependence. So this leads to theories of financial markets as potentially insane gambling casinos, Keynes's words, subject to tremendous instability, capable of generating out-of-control bubbles and financial panics like we saw in the US in the early 20s and after 2007. Keep in mind this interview is 2016. And this is exacerbated by the fact that many purchases people or firms make involve borrowed money. To invest in the stock market or in capital goods in the boom of the late 1920s, it affects your balance sheet. Keynes is saying the problems faced in the early 1930s was that everyone had tremendously fragile balance sheets in which assets, both financial and non-financial, were all subject to collapse. So Keynes says that the decision we make now will make the system more or less rigid and more or less vulnerable and more or less fragile. And we have to have a theory about how you make decisions under this. So he creates a theory that says people can't know the future, but it disturbs them, it confuses them, it makes them nervous. They try to calm their nerves, that's a phrase of Keynes, and even to pretend that the future is more knowable than it actually is. So they create behavioral psychological heuristics to make decisions. You have to apply that theory of conventional psychological heuristics to expectations of everything important, and you have to incorporate the balance sheet's effects and vulnerabilities in this system. when people come to make decisions about what the future looks like, they tend to extrapolate the recent past into the future. And they do this with more or less confidence in the accuracy of their expectations. So Keynes defines a concept of confidence, which has disappeared from Keynesian discourse and is one of the most important concepts ever. Now, notice, first of all, we're going to come to Minsky, but notice that, and basically everything that Minsky brings, Crotty discovers when he goes to Keynes and reads Keynes very closely. So this prioritization of financial dynamics, first of all, leads Crotty away from the idea of a regime of capitalism. For him, any regime can be self-undermining, that with feedback loops within the realm of finance, once this regime has escaped effective regulation, and the masters of that regime, the masters of capital, can buy off national regulators, and particularly financial capital, and particularly leading to a speculation-prone, bubble-driven pattern of growth that undercuts the steady accumulation of capital in the real sector. Indeed, Crotty comes to the idea that financial behavior under advanced capitalism can undercut non-financial accumulation processes. This then leads him actually to profound critiques of the work of many Keynesians, including two of the most prominent Keynesians of our time, Keynesians that have shaped subsequent post-Keynesian macroanalysis, James Tobin and Hyman Minsky. Both advanced theories that undercut their intention of showing the need to control market processes. So Tobin's Q theory of investment, which is that the price commanded by your equity share divided by the cost of increasing that company's productive capacity, that's the Q ratio, determines whether investment occurs. Now, this theory is set into a portfolio equilibrium model that he develops with Brainard, in which is actually the frame of the stock flow consistent model that so many Keynesians are relying upon today, post-Keynesians, I should say. Tobin, for one thing, assumes that shareholders and managers share the same objectives, and then sets out a model that's a neoclassical general equilibrium model. Tobin invisibilizes labor. He admits in his presidential address to the American Economic Association that there might be disequilibrium there, but not in the labor market, but not at the macro level. There, it's a portfolio equilibrium. Now, Minsky adopts theory Q as his own theory of investment, as this aligns him with Tobin's mainstream model, and is convenient for his emphasis on financial forces and their importance in capitalist dynamics. But both of these theories invisibilize labor and class conflict. And beyond this, in Minsky's model, this is now quoting from Crotty, every conceivable level of investment, of gross investment, will generate an equal level of gross savings, so that aggregate excess demand will be zero at every level of investment. Every level of investment is self-sustaining. The rate of profit is likewise constant, no matter what the level of investment. Now, let me pause here to say, I had a chance to interview, I spent some days in the spring of 1996 with Minsky. I'll get to this in the middle of this page. So, once again, Crotty is drilling down into the internal logic of these Keynesian models, and he finds, as he was trained, right, in that sharp way that he got alongside Lucas and Prescott at Carnegie Mellon. And his drill down finds that while they do emphasize finance, in contrast to those early chapters of Capital, they lack a crisis trigger. A situation that they describe could go on and on. Profits could be funneled to financial firms, which could be linked to rising asset prices, which could lead to ever higher profits in the financial sector as the real sector stagnates in a pure Minskian model. I talked to Jan Toporowski about this recently, and he agreed with that. He said, there's no reason in principle, Minskian, right, in his mind, why this couldn't continue. Minsky, in turn, going back to that talk with him just prior to his death later that year, he was coming through the American West. He stopped at Riverside. We had one last talk, and I could see that he was not going to live long. And so I said, here's the time to ask a question you want to ask. said, "Hi, why is there no labor in your model?" Minsky said, "Well, I grew up in the time of McCarthyism, the Red Scare, and everybody was being blamed as a communist. So I wanted to build a theory of crisis, of capitalist crisis, where you couldn't blame labor." Well, that may be, but the result is that we now have Minsky theories and so on, and Minsky's own work that's incomplete. And frankly, Minsky liked the fact that a leading Keynesian, Tobin, had theory Q. He wanted to be accepted by that more polite and more acceptable audience, I guess. And I remember a discussion behind closed doors with Jim Crotty. I think it was 1983. Minsky had given a talk at UMass Amherst, and Crotty closed the door and said, "Hi, we need to talk. Hi, you have no theory of investment." And he goes through theory Q and Minsky's two-price theory, which is theory Q and all that. And Minsky got really upset because Minsky wanted to be right. He wanted to be taken back into the fold of influential mainstream people. He thought he could convince them. He spent many years with that. That's another talk. But at some point, Hai was resisting, and Crotty said, "Look, Hai, we're Marxist, and we're the only people that get you." It was quite a moment. I was just a third-year graduate student at the time. Okay, the links between this theoretical view and the relatively sunny views of capitalist transformation that have followed this are clear. We have PERI Merriling and Robert Schiller talking about the shift from bank-based to market-based, shadow banking-based credit systems as a simple evolutionary advance. They miss the part about financial power and destabilization. And frankly, modern monetary theory proponents of that are confident that the state can provide the money needed to permit the enabling of policy measures that soak up underutilized labor and resources. Essentially, the idea here is that basically, if there's a failure in capitalism, it's a failure of policy. Just have the right policy and it will go very right. And I would just say that what Crotty admires in Keynes is something that he finds a little bit lacking in some of the other theorists, this word courage. Keynes had the courage, back to the interview here, to construct a theory of agent choice under the assumption of radical uncertainty that he embedded in his aggregate demand model that has proven to be extremely insightful about the strengths and flaws in capitalist economies. Now, I think that's his main contribution. Now, would you like me to comment on what Marx brings to the table? Now, we'll stop there because now we're going to get into just a page acknowledging Jim's intellectual work on East Asia. Now, this is, first of all, Jim hosted a series of Japanese scholars at UMass Amherst, and this plus the influence of his work led to invitations to Japan and to Korea, which were very important in his overall development because, as I put here in the title of this section, it allows him to find the broader frame. He steps out of his US centrism and sees the broader landscape. It allows him to break through to the final next stage of his work on capitalism. And so just to say that the East Asian crisis of 1997 and the subsequent IMF intervention led to Jim stepping into the analysis of crises in Asia, especially East Asia. Jim and I wrote a paper in 1998 on the Korean crisis that rejected this simplistic moral hazard game theoretic explanation of that crisis by Krugman and others, and which again was based on the idea of that the center of the world is the equilibrium model of the neoclassicals. And we instead we pointed in our work to the importance of suppressing Korean labor and opening the country to foreign capital. Interestingly, we sent our paper to the Monthly Review. It was rejected by Harry Magdoff for focusing on the local determinants of the crisis, not its global causes. I should say that paper we sent then to Malcolm Sawyer, who was then at the University of Leeds. Malcolm became my colleague here. He's just retired a couple of years ago. But basically, so that was my first significant link with Malcolm. Now, Konkuk, Lee, and Jim wrote several very important papers setting out a profound critique of the IMF policy approach, showing how its interventions actually generated the profound crisis that occurred in the way it occurred with devastating consequences. I should say we're now living in an era where the IMF is sort of trying to reinvent itself, but you will see that there is a struggle at the soul of that institution. And I would urge you to go and read Konkuk and Jim's work on the IMF, which is the most profound work that I think I've seen on the impact and scope of IMF interventions. We saw that directly when Jim and I visited Korea, and we were in the chambers of government and so on, and saw that the IMF staff were calling all the shots at that time. That was early 1998 when we visited. Okay. Another thing that was crucial for Jim was his year in Hitotsubashi. It actually comes before this period of the Korean crisis, but here this time at Hitotsubashi it allowed Jim to make his next break in understanding Keynes. Here's a quote from the interview. In 1995, I was in residence at Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo in Japan. Hitotsubashi means one bridge. I was always confused because there were no bridges on the campus. So I had little to do except to give a set of lectures to the faculty. It had a really good library in English. So I spent a lot of time reading the collected works of Keynes, many of the volumes. I also spent a lot of time reading British political, economic history. If I can pause, you see, stepping out of the US frame and contextualizing Keynes as a British economist writing in effect about Britain. Okay. I discovered that the Keynes that I'd been taught was not the right Keynes historically, and this was interesting for a number of reasons. Keynes is maybe one of the 2 or 3 most famous economists in history. So how could we have gotten all this stuff so wrong about Keynes? Now, we're going to jump now to Jim's work on financialized global capitalism. I'm going to be pretty short here because I want to really set up an extended discussion of his book, Keynes Against Capitalism, and to put that into the context of contemporary developments, both in heterodox theory and in degrowth and so on. So he writes many papers on macroeconomic dynamics in the era of financialized global capitalism. They're collected in the main book that's being honored today. He makes many fundamental points. For example, owner-management conflict is not just a game theoretic problem, but it extends to fundamental tensions in the social relations of production within and surrounding a firm about its purposes, who deserves what rewards, and so on. Another fundamental point is that, as he puts it in the title of one of his papers in that volume, the realism of assumptions does matter. The point of that paper is don't use efficient financial market theory when you're designing financial regulations. You'll be badly fooled. And I should also note, capital controls are an usually important tool for gaining macro policy control. There are many papers here. They don't use formalism, but they contain what can be an almost overwhelming set of references to expert opinion and statistics about market and economic trends. Now, to decode this pattern, I'm going to quote 2 excerpts from a letter that Jim wrote to me in 2002. This is, while he was on his road to what will be the creation of his book. That book writing took many years. He finally publishes it in 2018, I guess. And I should say that's a long story about where it got published and why, because it's to rethink Keynes as a socialist was something, and we'll get to that. This is from the letter that Jim wrote to me. He's writing about a draft of a paper I sent to him. The thing I like about this draft is that it comes close at times to using the macro-micro dialectic that I try to base my story of changes in globally contested markets on. Here you often ground micro change, shifts in banking strategy and practice, on two factors that are quite interrelated in my view: changes in the macro environment, especially slower growth and higher inflation, and a rising degree of competition along some dimensions of financial activity. Now, see, there's that stagnation, that degree of monopoly that actually is central in his theory. It's just that he wants the whole theory: class struggle plus monopoly and stagnation on the global stage. Okay, back to Jim. From my perspective, the mostly missing part of the dialectic is in the papers the feedback from the macro DOC-induced changes back to the macro DOC level, which I do try to do. Now, see, those of you who know Jim know that he would criticize anything and always find a way to make it better. Of course, the strength of this paper, back to the letter, raises a truly key question that I raised to you earlier. Does the theory of natural oligopoly apply to important segments of financial markets? And if so, why? The answer to this question affects everything, especially the conclusions about where finance and banking might be headed. Now, this is the question that he's going to ask himself. I lay out the necessary assumptions as I see them for natural oligopolies in the paper I sent you. Now, I'm just going to do 2 pages here in which he's thinking out loud about what he'll be formalizing. Basically, large fixed costs and economies of scales of some kind make it necessary to hold price well above marginal cost. That is, excessive competition that pushes prices down toward marginal costs makes it impossible to recoup the fixed costs and threatens the reproduction of the industry, the financial industry, of course. Other key assumptions include excess capacity to be avoided at all costs because it triggers price wars. Exit is very costly due to the immobility of real human and organizational capital, and thus entry is costly as well. And this makes it very difficult to lower excess capacity via exit. Innovation is costly and risky. All these things mean that the key firms, which are small in number due to economies of scale, have to cooperate to some degree to avoid excess capacity, hold price above marginal costs, and provide adequate insurance that long-run investments are likely to pay off. Coined the term, we're continuing the letter here, this is 2002, co-respective competition to capture the fact that cooperation along some lines, like avoiding price wars, was necessary for industry reproduction, though competition along other lines, like cost-cutting and technological improvement, product innovation, and so on, could be fierce. I then lay out an argument that adequate AD growth and many other things that need state intervention in markets are necessary conditions for co-respective competition, and that aggregate demand growth and co-respective competition are necessary for high road labor relations. So there are macro and degree of competition requirements for good micro performance. I then argue that good micro performance is a necessary condition for aggregate demand growth and low degrees of competition. I then use this dialectic to explain the shift from the GA to neoliberalism and why neoliberalism can't work in the long run. Phew. Yeah, exactly. That's Jim. He's not going to make the complex simple. He's going to force theory to confront that complexity. So let's just take 2 pages here, picking up from an article he writes in 2008, June 2008, right 3 months before, or 4, the September 2008 collapse of the US financial system. If financial market competition is intense, why are financial firms' profits so high? Now, again, what you'll see here is he talks about the Volcker Paradox, which is exactly, if financial market competition is intense, why are financial firm profits so high? He calls that the Volcker Paradox. And look at what he comes up with here. Compare this to the letter he wrote 6 years before. Financial firms have been growing in a high growth industry, operating a high growth industry. The rise of market power sustained high profitability. Profit rates have risen because risks have risen. New banking strategies trade off high risk for high profit. Non-bank institutional investor compensation incentives induce risk taking. Many institutional investors must achieve a high return on assets. If not with safe assets, then they must shift to high risk assets. And giant banks have become innovation machines that can protect high profit margins on most derivative profits. Now, here's a quote just at the end of this paper. In the body of this paper, I suggested that the astounding returns of the era would disappear with the extraordinary but ephemeral perfect calm in financial markets in the past few years. When, as is inevitable, storms return to these markets, the unreliability of the rosy risk assessments generated by VAR exercises will be exposed, and the high profits of the recent past will dissipate. Risk-taking has become so widespread and leverage has become so high that a systemic crisis is not out of the question. History insists that there are no permanent perfect calms. The Financial Times respected analyst John Plender recently assessed systemic risk in today's financial markets. He noted a virtual consensus among leading practitioners and central bankers that another major shock is likely, and the potential damages could be greater than those caused by previous shocks. Now, this paper is published in June 2008. That means it's finished probably in, let's say, November 2007. He sees it coming. That's Jim. Now let's turn to the kind of major part two of this talk, which is the analysis of his book, Keynes Against Capitalism. And this one I'm going to put into context. And we've got several parts of this. And just to say, this paper, this book, in some sense, represents a final answer to the question that our students, we students of Jim, we're always asking, what's the defining idea? We think of him in Macro 3, this third semester macro class, not required at UMass, in which he'd sit on the desk, swinging his legs in his blue shirt, his tan pants, dressed like a 1950s guy, reading the texts of the great thinkers. He would often bring into the room a very marked up copy of Marx's Capital, Volume 3, and read it to us and have us reflect and discuss about that. So, Keynes and Marx are his avatars, but Keynes is his muse, his mystery. He's trying to unpack Keynes, and he finally gets to it in this book. It took him some years to publish this book. It was not easy, and I was part of that journey, just as a, I guess, referee or reviewer. Basically, he poses a question, and he comes up with, in a sense, a final answer. Now, back in the beginning, U.S. out of Vietnam. Here, his final answer is Keynes was a socialist. Now, this text makes a fundamental contribution to the debate of this very question, which is itself transforming political possibilities in our time. In this new journal called the Jacobin, the Socialist Manifesto, this young man, Bhaskar Sunkara, writes in the Socialist Manifesto, it was the economist John Maynard Keynes, a liberal who believed socialists were well-intentioned idiots who presented the best approach at the time to taming capitalism. And then Jeff Mann, in a very interesting book called In the Long Run, We're All Dead, Mann traces to Robespierre the idea that trust in the people doesn't mean turning over all political questions to the vote of all, for this can lead to chaos and revenge. Rather, trust in the people means to manage the people so as to bring about a civil state of affairs. Those who want to secure the people's freedom but cannot trust the people to do so, they are Keynesians, or radicals harboring a secret Keynesianism. When the social order is fraying, Keynesianism is the art and science of revolution without revolutionaries. That's Jeff Mann. Now, very much on the same page is Robert Skidelski, whose 3-volume work, Biography of Keynes, is absolutely must-reading. It's thousands of pages, but it's fundamental. And in The Return of the Master, a book that Skidelski writes just as the crisis has come, Keynes was not a socialist, but nor was he an uncritical admirer of capitalism. He saw it as a necessary stage to get societies from poverty to abundance, after which its usefulness would disappear. This brings him close to the Karl Marx of the Communist Manifesto. But unlike Marx, he did not look forward to capitalism's violent overthrow, nor did he think it was inevitable. He wanted to preserve capitalism from its wreckers on both the extreme right and the extreme left. This aim underpinned his politics of the middle way. In line with his evolutionary perspective, he rejected a notion of a sharp break between capitalist and post-capitalist societies. And later in another book, Skidelski writes, Keynes's theory could have become the basis of policy only under conditions of social balance. His was the economics of the middle way, the best deal that liberal capitalism could expect in a world veering toward the political extremes. Now, Crotty quotes Keynes as follows, and this is Keynes, a quote from Keynes as such. But now we are entering on a third era, which Professor Commons, of course, John Commons, calls the period of stabilization and truly characterizes as the actual alternative to Marxist communism. In this period, he said, there is a diminution of individual liberty, enforced in part by governmental sanctions, but mainly by economic sanctions through concerted actions. The abuses of this epoch in the realms of government are fascism on the one side and Bolshevism on the other. Socialism offers no middle course. The transition from economic anarchy to a regime which deliberately aims at controlling and directing economic forces in the interest of social justice and social stability will present enormous difficulties, both tactical and political. I suggest, nevertheless, that the true destiny of the new liberalism is to seek their solution. Now, this is Maynard Keynes' essay, 1925, Am I a Liberal? Now, he put forward a plan then for British industry. And basically, this is Jim's description in the book of Keynes's plan for liberal socialism. And it shows that they evolved in real time and evolving circumstances. The defining features are as follows. The state needs to have control over national investment. Britain's industrial future needs a board of national investment. Second, the relevant ministries and central bank need staff capacity and expertise and the trust and democratic support of the people of the nation. Third, maintain adequate levels of aggregate demand so that you plan and move from strength, not from shortages and high unemployment. Fourth, don't rely on the government's fisc to provide needed aggregate demand. Get it by public and democratic control of investment. Fifth, the need to shift from focusing production and finance on foreign markets to instead focusing on domestic industry and consumers. Sixth, use available finance to instead finance national industry. You look at this and then look at elements of the Chinese model of today. Look at other countries, UK and so on. It's quite interesting. And just to continue with Jim's analysis in his book, all of these defining features are problematic today. Keynes's Board of National Investment idea, first, did not survive the internal politics of the late 1920s, and it would be challenged today. Secondly, thinking of the UK case, the UK lacks the staff and agency capacity to undertake the required coordination. For example, now we're lost in the post-Brexit period, and democratic support has splintered. Next, the UK has had 10 years of macroeconomic austerity. The economic data are good, but this hides many fragilities, and involuntary part-time work and so on. Fourth, there's aversion both to deficit spend and to the idea of public investment after so many years in the UK of Thatcherism and New Labour, the third way. Fifth, the integration of industrial production across national borders in global supply chains, and even when some part remains domestically produced, it makes localization of industrial production and use very problematic. You see the ships now lined up at the ports, the global supply chains, right? Six, repurposing committed finance so as to achieve national priorities contradicts the rules of the road that govern the market-based credit system. So, some of the conditions that were supporting the idea then that became the New Deal in the US, or the Keynesian revolution in macro policy, these have been inverted. First of all, Crotty highlights the importance of the inflation and deflationary pressures and the distributional consequences of policy, rentiers versus entrepreneurs, rentiers with the upper hand now. And the world has swung from deflation to chronic inflation back to deflation again. Now, maybe we're swinging back, but let's see. Another thing is that national control over finance, Keynes' idea of repurposing sinking funds to repay war debts and using them for industrial finance, this has been replaced since the 1980s by soft law global governance of market-based credit practices by too big to fail mega banks and shadow banks in cooperation with the G20 and the international financial institutions, from Brady bonds to subprime securitization to climate bonds to you name it. It's a mess right now. We're far from any national controls over finance. The idea of balancing trade and financial flows among nations has disappeared since the 1980s, and the idea of development as a big push problem for lower income economies is also disregarded. Now, in Keynes's era, cross-border national balance was an acknowledged goal of policy. The post-Bretton Woods world, however, has thrived on imbalances. I've been writing about this lately myself. The US cross-border imbalances provide the cross-border architecture of international goods and capital flows. Basically, the US in chronic current account deficit. This structural shift then means a chronic capital account surplus for the US. Money flows in. Now, in the 1980s, when I was at Brookings, people were talking about how this was the global comparative advantage of the US. We had a global comparative advantage in consumption. I heard the great thinkers at the Brookings lunch tables say this in 1986 when I was there. If everyone is in surplus, then one country can be in deficit. That's the US, and that's fine, which of course feeds that global financial complex. We then have these silly things like Bernanke's savings glut. We have the shortage of safe assets hypothesis of Caballero and others. We'll leave that for now. There's no, the next problem is there's no strategically positioned will to fix this. China, it's the Chinese century, China lacks the leverage. Its Belt and Road Initiative represents its own separate path and indeed is now in trouble. There's no will in the US, there's no will in Europe. Germany underinvested in its infrastructure, retains its export orientation. Its automobile industry represents a major share of its national employment, and it's headed right for the climate crisis, right into crisis. And so as on the economic front. And underneath all of this is secular stagnation. Crotty shows that it was a concern of Keynes in the 1920s. And of course, we recall Magdoff and Sweezy and monopoly capital. Now, the idea of a big push macro scale development is really dead. Back in 2000, Edelman and Yelden posed this question: is this the end of economic development? And they conclude, and I'll quote here their paper, this paper concludes that the openness and nature of short-term financial markets eliminate state use of interest and exchange rate policies, while the GATT and the World Trade Organization eliminate trade and commercial policy. As a result, developing countries are severely limited in the means they can employ to promote development. And so instead we see, bottom-up behavioral approaches to development. We have the Grameen Bank, microfinance. We now have Banerjee and Duflo, poor economics, the random controlled trials. Good Lord, give me a break. We also have people who are kind of insurrectionists going for circular economies, post-capitalism, imaginaries that are hostile to centralized solutions and that are weary of manipulated democracy. But the idea that the nation state is the wrong scale is also agreed by many activists and certainly by empowered players in the world of international financial institutions and of globalized finance. And these players are actively laying their plans for the next global phase of financialization. So we have, on the one hand, post-capitalist circular economy thinking, this idea that we should regain our imaginaries, we should escape neoliberalism and the corporatist Keynesianism, And the way we're going to do this is going back to thinking and planning at the grassroots level. The need for environmental sustainability will enable more circular economies driven by local actions at local scales. You don't need a planning guiding state. Paul Mason, 2015, his book, Post-Capitalism, he argues that most trade is now zero marginal cost services. So the capacity of multinational corporations to extract rents is falling. State regulation can protect local communities and reduce the scale of the market in favor of the local. Tim Jackson, another important ecological economist, prosperity without growth. The key to this transition is getting out of the trap of status-based competition and wasteful consumption cycles. It can be organized as a supply-driven, computable general equilibrium. Now, in some sense, that's right. We have to consume less. But do you really want a general equilibrium model at the center of your vision of how the economy works? What are you thinking? You're not thinking with Keynes, for sure. In this book, Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work, folk politics chooses the familiarities of the past over the unknowns of the future. So a 21st century left must seek to combine the centrality of work to contemporary life. In the end, our choice is between glorifying work and the working class or abolishing them both. The former position finds its expression in the folk political tendency to place value upon work, concrete labor, and craft work. Yet the latter is the only true post-capitalist position. Work must be refused and reduced, building our synthetic freedom in the process. Achieving this will acquire the realization of four minimal demands: full automation, the reduction of the working week, the provision of a basic income, the diminishment of the work ethic. And at some level, we see many people refusing work now, quitting their jobs after the pandemic. All right, yeah, we're weary of capitalism, we're weary of the pandemic, we're weary of isolation, we're weary of all this stuff. But does this mean that we can just turn our backs, that we don't need a systemic analysis, and in particular, that we don't need the guiding hand of a national state that has the belief and respect and support of its people, especially its working classes? Meanwhile, in globalist financial space, there was this agreement on sustainable development goals at the UN. There was the Addis Ababa Action Agenda agreed in 2015, where the UN member nations agreed that they should finance the SDGs. And the same year, you had the signing of the Paris Accords on financing measures to stop or adjust to climate change. UNCTAD, which I've been working with, has estimated that you need $2.5 trillion a year for the SDGs. That's 3% of global GDP. This is the same number, 3% of GDP, that Keynes critiqued as too small in the 1930s. This method of being experimented with, leaving aside whether it's too small, it's called blended finance. You leverage private capital by promising that public funds will absorb all the risk. You de-risk the money. Really, you de-risk the money. After all these years of neoliberal crisis, that's what you're going to do. The key here is the use of securitization, bundling of individual project loans into vehicles that can be bought by financial funds, Brady bonds, subprime securities, and so on. But it's all going to be scaled up. And at the moment, my statistics come from my November 2019 speech at the UN, where at that point they had raised only $170 billion for these purposes. That's only a fraction of what they need. And furthermore, big capital, Wall Street capital firms were not interested in this. They said it's too costly, too slow, too small. We don't want to do it. Now they set out this, nonetheless, the architecture for this blended finance system is set out by the G20 Eminent Persons Group, full of nothing but mainstream economists and advisors. It's called Making the Global Financial System Work for All. Check it out. At the top, you have the IMF in charge of the global economy. The IMF its board will maintain control and surveillance over the system. This is their words, not mine. The IFIs, the World Bank and the IMF, They should shift from loan making to loan guarantees and underwriting. Multilateral development banks should do the same. In other words, surrender all of your developmental capacity to the private markets. These markets will then be made and securitized on a local basis, and that will fund the actual projects, which will then be de-risked by governments and by multilateral development banks. Excellent idea, right? What are they thinking? Well, they're thinking for global capitalism. This is a post-nation state project, right? The role of national governments and of multilateral development banks is to be risk absorbers for the losses that will be incurred in global finance to support of global goals. There's a parallel here with the privatization of municipal finance. National democracies are already being eaten out from the inside. Restoring democracy means protecting the nation state. You need that support to have that national planning. It means a shift from capitalism to liberal socialism on a global scale, nation by nation, region by region, block by block. So these two paths sketched out above see the nation state fading away into the irrelevance, disempowered, an obstacle to achieving global goals, SDGs, climate emergency. At best, the state is a vehicle for underwriting the financial markets that are going to come to the rescue for their usual fees. That's St. George on the horse there on the cover of that book. But Crotty's work begins and shows this is an impossibility. The state is an entity that's been bought and paid for by powerful interests. New progressive movements will arise, and they'll demand national frameworks for reestablishing rights, justice, sustainability. And there'll be diverse movements. They'll be opposed by destructive movements seeking revenge. The mainstream will plead for civility. It will turn a blind eye to the power dynamics of race, gender, national origin, refugee status, all the rest. And, as at UMass Amherst, those of us who oppose this vision, activists from many corners, will need to find each other and hear each other, because the mainstream's blind eye supports the already empowered, not those who are oppressed. Yes, we need the social movements. Yes, we need the bottom-up push. We need the reestablishment of a global activism and a renewal of a democratically supported state with a progressive agenda. But we also need Macro 3. Now, I wrote a paper that appeared in 2014 that talked about our problem. And just a couple of pages here reflecting on that, what I did in that paper was to ask the question, the subprime crisis seemed to be a bullet that should have killed the neoclassical macro model. So why did it recover so quickly to business as usual? And I flagged two reasons why this decade of financial crisis has not led mainstream economists to rethink their commitment to general equilibrium models, especially their beloved DSGE. First is that mainstream and heterodox economists have different reference points. And secondly, there's asymmetric lines of communication within the profession. Who has access to whom, who talks to who listens to whom? That panel of experts that did that G20 report did not include one heterodox economist. There's not one heterodox economist who's a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States. Just saying, that's how it works. So we have, on the one hand, the neoclassical economists, and basically, at the center of their world is this sink. It all comes back to basically the allocation of resources in society involving rational choice. So they understand each other. Neoclassical models are understood according to the number of deviations made from Walrasian general equilibrium. They'll talk to you about Occam's razor, and they'll basically, what that means is how many deviations from WGE did you need to make to explain what you're trying to explain? By contrast, those of us who are outside of that mainstream, we live in a heterodox spiral. Capitalism can't be described by an autarkic equilibrium model of market processes. Capitalism is described by destabilizing tendencies. And these sources of destabilization include social power, fundamental uncertainty, class-based, gender-based, racial, ethnic inequality. There are many starting points and they're different. It's a spiral. So activists have to find each other. And when we do, we're going to need Macro 3, the Crottian approach. And just to summarize it on one page, first, We have to recognize that explanations rooted in neoclassical methods and assumptions are locked into a primary dialogue with the Walrasian general equilibrium as their key point of reference. They only make incidental contact with the real economies they're supposedly describing. Secondly, be careful about formal modeling because it'll lock you into highlighting the mechanisms that your mathematics privileges, and it restricts what you can bring into view. This was always Crotty's problem with Skidelski. Too much reliance, the engineer, on mathematical formalization. Thirdly, macroanalysis must include decision-making about investment, real-time and uncertainty, competition among firms, fundamental rules for money and credit, interaction between aggregate behavior and individual market outcomes, macro, micro, and the endogeneity of crisis, especially because of financial fragility and instability. Be critically engaged, fourthly, with mainstream macroeconomists nonetheless. Now, here's the book. Everyone, do yourself a favor and read from this book. It will change your life. I'm going to give the words here to Jim. Basically, this is back to the interview. And Jim they're reflecting on the debate at UMass Amherst. And he's going back to the 70s and then into the 80s. And that debate occurred, it was there while I was there and while Tetsuji and Yoshi and others were there. And in this debate, there were some who said that we should try to change the mainstream. I was much more cynical about that, about the ability to change the mainstream, and thought that we should be trying to create the best theories that we can, and whether the mainstream accepts them or not is probably not in our power to change, and is extremely unlikely. One could ask, well, did the mainstream get changed? I mean, for example, we have all these new Keynesian models, non-clearing labor markets, non-clearing credit markets, and so forth, Stiglitz and all that. The non-clearing labor markets were, I guess, a translation of Marxist theory into the mathematics, talking there about bulls. Some of us, including me, thought that these were fine, they were good, but they were quite limited, that the end result is not all that much. So you end up saying the labor market doesn't clear. The cost of job loss, right, with Sam Bowles and Gintis. The loan market doesn't clear at the Pareto optimal point, Stiglitz. How important is that? I don't know. If the standard Walrasian general equilibrium markets is here, now here you can imagine Jim sitting on that table in macro 3, swinging his legs, and he'll point to a dot in space. He points to a dot in front of him. And now we have markets that don't clear, and are they here? He points to a spot close to the original spot, or are they here? He points to a faraway spot. Are they big problems? Are they little teeny weeny problems? Can the state do anything about them? Is this a theory about a systematically integrated market system, or is it just about single markets that do not interact? When we do our non-clearing credit market models, do we say that we can't complete this analysis until we see what's happening in the labor market and vice versa? Okay, so we've improved on the absurd Walrasian fairy tale a little, but we really have nothing systemic to put in its place as a theory of capitalism. Now, while there are some game theoretic models that give some insights into market processes, I don't consider this to be a really great advance. We're not going to convert the mainstream. The mainstream does what it does, and they're not interested in us, I don't think. Now, I have to say, when I last saw Jim, I was involved in an effort to rethink macroeconomics in the UK. I led one of the research hubs. I had led the left bid and so on. And basically Jim was skeptical. And I have to say, now that that project is done, no, we didn't change the mainstream. They're looking at behavioral economics. They're looking at silly things. They're not looking at the system as a whole. They've forgotten Marx, and frankly, they've forgotten these parts of Keynes that are inconvenient. So there's a picture of Jim and his beloved Pam at the dedication of Jim and Pam Crotty Hall at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, March 2017. And it's Crotty Hall. And you know, his name will be on that building. but his work will live in our minds, just as the generosity of spirit of the man, it will live in our hearts. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gary Dymski, or just say Gary. Yeah. And actually, yeah, Gary traces a long academic journey by James Crotty, and his lecture covers so many important aspects of various debates, creating Marx versus Keynes, as well as mainstream neo-classical economics. They are all very important for the JSP members, including the perspectives of the alternative society in the future, or post-global capitalism, or post-capitalist society in general. So I believe this is a very important opportunity for the JSP members to push our studies in that kind of direction, I think. And yeah, especially Gary proposed the kind of the way to make critics of the mainstream, classical economics. But anyway, Gary covers a very broad areas of the study, so I don't summarize the or so audience have the, I hope, the very clear image of the message, I think. So we'd like to have the 5-minute break, and then we enter the Q&A session. Is that okay? All right.
Right.
はい、それでは5分間休憩して、その間にもし質問やですね、コメントございましたら考えておいてください。日本語でも結構です。日本語の場合は、なんとか私が英語にして伝えます。Yeah, it's okay to have the question or comment in Japanese. I will, interpret it and to make clear to you, Gary. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We have a 5-minute break here.